April 1945. Southern Germany. Late afternoon. A captured headquarters lay in disarray, maps ripped from walls, telephones dangling dead, the smell of burned paper still heavy in the air. Outside, engines idled and boots shifted in the gravel as American troops tightened the cordon. Inside the command room, beneath a single bare bulb, a German general stood rigid, jaw locked, eyes burning with a fury that had outlived the Reich he served. When the demand for surrender came, he did not hesitate. "You'll have to shoot me first." The words cut through the room. Rifles lifted, fingers tightened on triggers. The war had reduced empires to moments like this, seconds where pride and survival stood inches apart. The German officer did not flinch. He had commanded men. He had watched them die. He would not be taken like a clerk clearing a desk. Then footsteps entered the room, slow and deliberate. George S. Patton stepped forward, riding crop tucked under his arm, helmet angled just so. His uniform was immaculate, almost defiant in its order. He surveyed the scene with practiced contempt, not for the enemy, but for the waste of it. The raised weapons, the trembling paws, another death waiting to be justified. Patton lifted a hand. The rifles lowered. The German general stared at him, confused now, anger cracking into something closer to disbelief. This was not how such encounters were supposed to end. There were scripts for defeat. There were scripts for martyrdom. This was neither. Patton spoke quietly, not to dominate, not to threaten. "The war is over," he said. "Dying now will prove nothing." The words landed heavier than any shouted command. Outside, artillery rumbled in the distance, far enough to remind them the world was still burning, close enough to confirm the end was inevitable. The German general's breathing slowed. His defiance, moments earlier so absolute, now had nowhere to go.
Silence stretched. Seconds passed, then more. Finally, with hands that no longer shook, the general reached for his belt. The metal buckle rasped softly as he unfastened it. He drew his pistol, paused, then placed it on the table between them. No shot was fired. No honor was salvaged. Only the truth remained. The surrender in that room did not happen by accident. It was the product of a war already decided, though not yet admitted, by men who could still not bring themselves to stop fighting. By April 1945, Germany was collapsing in plain sight. Allied forces were crossing the Rhine in strength, measured not in divisions, but in inevitability. Cities were falling intact or in flames. Communications fractured. Orders contradicted one another, then ceased altogether. Headquarters like this one, once centers of authority, had become islands of denial. For the German officer who refused to surrender, the moment was not tactical, it was existential. He had sworn oaths not merely to a nation, but to a vision of permanence. For years, retreat had been forbidden. Surrender is treated as treason. Officers were expected to die where they stood, to prove loyalty even as the ground disappeared beneath them. Many did exactly that. In the final months of the war, German generals destroyed their own records, disbanded units without orders, or chose death rather than capture. Some shot themselves in bunkers as Soviet artillery closed in. Others ordered meaningless counterattacks that bled their remaining men dry, all to delay an ending that no longer belonged to them. The American advance moved through this psychological wreckage with brutal speed. For the commander who now stood in that ruined headquarters, the war had always been personal. He believed in momentum, in fear as a weapon, in forcing decisions before the enemy could retreat into pride. He despised hesitation almost as much as defeat, but he understood something many did not. When a war is truly over, killing no longer proves strength, it proves blindness.
His own troops had seen enough death.
They had fought across France, across rivers that swallowed tanks, through towns where civilians watched silently from shattered windows. They were trained to shoot. They were ready to shoot. That was not the question. The question was whether this moment would add meaning or merely another body. The German general understood this too, slowly. His defiance had been his last command. Once spoken, it could not be taken back. If he were shot, he would become exactly what the old order demanded, a final symbol, a dead officer who had not surrendered. But symbols were losing their power. Outside the building, the world had already moved on. American columns pushed east, prisoners marched west, flags were being folded, burned, or hidden. Even loyalty had begun to feel obsolete. The silence in the room forced the German officer to confront a truth no briefing had prepared him for. This was not a duel, it was an ending. There would be no audience, no redemption, only a body on a floor that would be swept clean within the hour. His hand loosened. The pistol on the table was more than a weapon, it was the last authority he possessed. When he released it, he did not simply surrender his life, he surrendered the story he had been taught to believe. The war would end without his death, and that, to him, was the deepest defeat of all. The decision to lower the weapons reverberated far beyond that single room. For the American troops who witnessed it, the moment cut against everything they had been trained to expect. They had crossed continents under orders that left little room for mercy. Enemy officers were dangerous until disarmed. Resistance was to be met with overwhelming force. The line between restraint and hesitation had cost lives before. Yet here stood a commander who understood when authority demanded stillness instead of violence. The German general was escorted out under guard, his posture unchanged, his eyes fixed forward. But something had shifted. He was no longer defiant, he was empty. The uniform still fits, the rank still showed, but command, the thing he had lived for, was gone. Not stripped by gunfire, but dissolved by reality. Across Germany, scenes like this were repeating with variations of tragedy and absurdity. Entire units surrendered to patrols a fraction of their size. Officers negotiated the terms of their own irrelevance. Others clung to orders issued by a government that no longer controlled its capital. Some continued fighting for days, even weeks, until food ran out or ammunition failed. This fragmentation of authority was the true end of the war. For years, German command had relied on discipline enforced by fear. Now, fear had nowhere to point. Hitler was sealed in Berlin. Communications were severed. The chain of command existed only in memory. In its place stood men alone with their choices. The American High Command understood what this meant. The faster the war ended, the fewer civilians would die. The fewer pointless last stands would be staged in towns that could not defend themselves. Every unnecessary death in April 1945 was a failure, not of courage, but of judgment. That was the calculation behind moments like this one. The German general would be questioned, processed, and sent to a prison camp. He would live to see the Reich dismantled piece by piece, live to hear that Berlin had fallen, live to learn that the war he had sworn to die for ended without ceremony, without glory, without him. For Patton, there was no sentiment attached. He did not see himself as merciful. He saw himself as efficient. The war demanded speed now, not spectacle. A dead officer proved nothing. A surrendered headquarters meant roads opened, maps captured, units dissolved without bloodshed. And yet, for all his blunt pragmatism, the moment lingered. It lingered because it exposed the lie at the heart of total war, the idea that dying is always more honorable than living with defeat. In that room, the myth failed. The pistol lay silent. The choice had been made. Not by ideology, not by fear, but by the simple recognition that the future would arrive whether one welcomed it or not. Outside, engines revved,
Orders were shouted. Columns resumed their march eastward. The war continued, just without that death. The irreversible choice had already been made the moment the pistol touched the table. In wars, decisions are often disguised as instincts: shoot, advance, destroy. But this moment was different. It was deliberate, calculated, final in its restraint. Once the German general surrendered alive, there could be no reversal, no heroic rewrite. His men would follow. His sector would collapse quietly. The line would move forward without resistance. And that silence would cost the Reich more than any last stand. For the German officer, the weight of that decision settled heavily as he was led away. He had not been broken by force. He had been disarmed by certainty. There would be no firing squad to immortalize him, no final report praising his loyalty. He would live in captivity, stripped of relevance, forced to watch the world move on without him. That was the price. For Patton, the cost was different. He understood how thin the line was between command and chaos. Had a single rifle gone off, the room would have erupted. Blood would have justified blood. Another death would have been written into the ledger of April 1945, another name lost in a month already drowning in them. Instead, the war moved forward intact. American intelligence officers poured through the headquarters within minutes. Maps were seized, unit locations confirmed, supply routes exposed. What might have taken days of fighting was resolved in an hour. Entire formations downstream would surrender once word spread that their commander was gone, not dead, but irrelevant. This was how wars actually ended, not with grand speeches or final charges, but with men like this one, with men realizing that the authority they believed eternal had already evaporated, that their choices now belonged not to history, but to survival.
The German general would later claim he had done his duty. Perhaps he had. But duty without power is only memory, and memory does not command troops. By nightfall, the headquarters was abandoned. American vehicles rolled through without opposition. Civilians emerged cautiously from cellars. White flags appeared in windows, not out of loyalty, but exhaustion. The machinery of conquest continued, cleaner, faster, quieter. What could not be undone was now obvious. The Reich had lost not just territory, but will. Not just leaders, but belief. And once belief collapses, armies follow. The pistol remained behind, tagged and catalogued. A small artifact of a moment when pride had nearly demanded death and failed. When the war in Europe finally ended weeks later, it did not end with moments as the German general had imagined. There was no final duel of honor, no last battlefield where loyalty redeemed defeat. It ended in offices, in classrooms turned into command posts, in railway yards filled with prisoners walking west under guard. The surrender in that headquarters was not recorded as a turning point. It was too quiet for that, too ordinary. And yet it captured the true conclusion of the conflict more honestly than any parade or proclamation. Power had shifted completely. The men who once issued orders now received them. The empires that promised eternity vanished in days. Those who survived would carry something heavier than wounds, the knowledge that they had outlived the cause that defined them.
For the American commander, the moment passed without ceremony. He did not pause to reflect. He never needed to. His war was still moving, still demanding decisions measured in lives saved or wasted. But history would remember that he recognized the final phase of victory when others still mistook death for purpose. The German general disappeared into the vast machinery of post-war reckoning. Interrogations, internment, years of waiting as borders were redrawn, and verdicts delivered by courts instead of artillery. He would see Germany reduced, divided, and remade without him, alive but permanently displaced from power. That was the real punishment. This moment mattered not because a man lived, but because a myth died. The myth that courage demanded death. The myth that surrender erased honor. The myth that war could always be concluded with a shot. In that room, those myths were dismantled quietly. The war ended not with a gunfire echo, but with a pistol placed on a table, with an admission no ideology could escape, with a future that arrived regardless of belief. Some endings are loud. The most important ones are not.